Alright, so in this video we're going to be taking a look at the updated FM-4 synthesizer in the newly released Bitwig 2.0. So in keeping with what they've done with a lot of their other devices, is they've gone through and they've actually just kind of stripped out the modulation section of FM-4 and pretty much just collapsed it down, moving all of the modulators off to the little tab on the left bottom corner. We get these little plus icons where we can click and add things like LFOs or extra envelopes or some kind of crazy other things, because these modulators are kind of the new concept here in Bitwig 2.0. So we'll be looking at these modulators in other videos, or I'm sure there's probably tons of people on YouTube already that have talked about the modulators. So if you're looking for information on those modulators, either check out some of the other videos on my channel, or go ahead and search on YouTube and find somebody else. What the FM-4 is, if you've never messed with it, or what have you, you're brand new to Bitwig and you're just looking at FM-4 for the first time, is it's a 4-operator FM synthesizer, hence its name, FM-4. And FM synthesis is a style of synthesis or a mode of synthesis that was discovered by this guy named John Chowning. You could YouTube search him and find both him speaking as well as tons of people talking about the mathematics behind FM synthesis. And we'll get into it a little bit in this video, but we're not going to talk really about the math behind it. I'm just going to kind of show you visually and sonically what FM synthesis is. In brief, you could think of the movie WALL-E, about that little robot who goes into space. So the lay of the land with FM-4 is across the left-hand side we have our 4 oscillators. Each of these produce essentially sine tones, which we'll talk about what I mean by essentially in a second. Then we've got across the top a noise generator that's got a built-in filter and drive circuit to it. And then underneath that we have our modulation matrix, which allows us to control the routings of all these oscillators and the noise source and how they're influencing and how much they're influencing the frequency of one another. Then underneath that we've got our single amplitude envelope generator, which is hardwired to the gain or the volume of FM-4, but it could also be routed other places just by clicking on that little modulation route button and then clicking and dragging up or down to set how much you want that amplitude envelope to influence that parameter. So probably the first thing that you'd want to know about it is that if I play a note and I want that note to last longer, that means I have to have some sustain. And by default, most of Bitwig's envelope generators have no sustain. So I'll click and drag that up and then play again. And as long as I hold that note, it's now going to exist infinitely. Same thing with attack. If I want it to be a slower attack, drag that up. Now it swells in. Longer release. So on and so forth. So I'm going to quickly return this though back to our default state, load default preset, boom. But also notice that if I right click on the left bar of FM-4, this is where I could either load a default preset, so replace whatever I've done with the original version of the FM-4, or if I'm unhappy with the default settings, perhaps maybe I want that sustain dial to be all the way up when I first load up the FM-4, I could come in here and just say save the current state of this FM-4 as the default preset. So every time after this I load up the default version of FM-4, it'd be however I set it up to be, which could be really handy, especially if you're like me and you want sustain immediately. So moving past that, then we've got the output mixer, where we can control how much of each of the 4 oscillators and the noise source are being passed to the output of FM-4. And we've got global transposition and the glide. So when I play one note and then another note, how long does it take for the output pitch of FM-4 to go from the old to the new? The global pan for FM-4, the global gain or volume for the FM-4. Then we've got 2 slots for loading up either note effects or audio effects inside of FM-4, which means that the modulation sources of FM-4 can take control over those effects as well. Then a button to toggle on or off mono versus polyphonic modes for the FM-4. So in mono, we can only play one note at a time. With that turned off, we can play many notes at a time. If we have mono mode enabled, then these 2 buttons underneath here allow us to either set a single trigger, which means that if I play one note and continue to hold that one note and then play several other notes, the envelope, so just the amplitude envelope in this case, will not re-trigger until I release all currently held notes and then start playing new notes again. So it just will trigger that envelope once for all those notes. And then legato glide, only glide when played legato, which just means that if I play one note and I want it to glide to the next note, I've got to hold down that first note for just a little bit longer when I start playing the new note so that they're kind of slurred together and then they'll glide together. But if I play them separately, then there will be no glide. Then finally, the volume output, up, down, louder, quieter. So that's the lay of the land with FM-4. If we look in now at each of the oscillators, they're all exactly the same, but we can set them all differently. So it starts on the left-hand side with being able to enable or disable that oscillator, turn it on or off. And then we have two means of controlling the tuning of each of these oscillators. The upper box sets the ratio to the incoming MIDI note. So if I have it set to 1, currently we're only listening to oscillator 1, then we get exactly the frequency of the played note. So if I jump up an octave on my MIDI keyboard, we get up the octave. But we could also change by saying, in fact, give me always 2 times the expected frequency. So if I play a note, I didn't jump up the octave on my keyboard, but the frequency of this oscillator jumped up by octave, or any relationship or ratio in between. So now as I play other notes, it sounds like it's properly in tune, but it's actually a little bit sharp from the note that we had expected to play. So the ratio to the incoming MIDI note, I'm going to turn that back to 1. And then underneath that, we have a hertz offset from that ratio. So in this case, now we're adding a little bit or subtracting a little bit. So I can make it a little bit sharp or a little bit flat. Let's bring up that sustain so we can hear this. A little bit sharp, a little bit flat, and then let's return that to 0. So if I wanted this oscillator to never move depending upon the notes that I'm playing, I could just set the ratio to 0, and then now we've got just one really super low frequency. I could sweep that up. For those of you subwoofers, your speakers probably just blew up. And now it doesn't matter what note I play, I'm always getting that set frequency because there is 0 relationship to the incoming MIDI note. So let's set that back to 0 and return our ratio to 1. Then to the right of that, we have a dial that lets us control how much this oscillator is being fed into our modulation network. So if I drag that down, then there's nothing being fed into our modulation network. If I drag that all the way up, then there's the maximum amount of influence or signal being sent from this oscillator to the modulation network. So all those parameters are the same for the other 3 oscillators: on, off, ratio to the MIDI note, frequency either up or down from that MIDI note, and then how much is it being fed into our modulation network. And with the noise source, similarly, we can turn it on or off. So let's go down and let's turn the volume of our first oscillator all the way down, or the output volume, and then bring all the noise up so we can hear that. So on or off, and it's got a low pass filter on it, so I can sweep this up or sweep it down. And then it's got Q or resonance on that, so you can hear right now it's getting really squelchy because it's really boosting that point of cutoff on our filter, which as I sweep this up a little bit, we can kind of see that in our spectrogram over there. Notice there's a huge bump right there. As I start to reduce down that Q, that bump kind of smooths out and we get less of a focus on that point of cutoff, and now we've got much smoother low pass filter happening. So low pass filter and cue or focus at that, which can get pretty nasty. Then next to that, we've got some drive that allows us to boost the level of this noise source. And it actually sounds like it's got a built-in limiter because we could really drive this thing and it can sound like we're probably peaking out Bitwig. But if you look at all the meters, either after after the FM-4 or at the local track or at the master track, as we start to drive this, it does get louder, but eventually it stops getting louder and it just sounds like it's blowing up. You can kind of get a square wave generator out of it. So you can kind of see the use of being able to distort that noise circuit or that noise generator, and that eventually we kind of hit this hard limiter inside of FM-4 that flat tops both the top and the bottom of that noise source and lets us get to kind of some randomish square wave type stuff. So we bring that drive back down, we get back down to just some really low filtered noise and sweeping that back up. Cool. So that's the noise source, and a kind of allusion to where we're going with the mixer there. Quickly return this back to its default state. Default, there we go. And we'll skip the modulation matrix for now. We've already talked about the amplitude envelope generator, but again, that just allows us to control how the volume output of our FM-4 behaves over time in relationship to the incoming MIDI note. So we can have a long attack time, a mediocre sustaining value, we can have a super short decay time, so it suddenly jumps down to our sustaining value, and then a moderate release time. So once I release that note, how long does it take for the volume of our FM-4 to go back down? So that's the amplitude envelope generator. There we go. To the right of that is the mixer section, which just allows us to control how loud or how much signal of each of our 4 oscillators and the noise source is being fed out. And then we already talked about the rest of this at the start of this video. Which brings us to the modulation network. So, FM synthesis, using one oscillator to modulate the frequency of another oscillator. To investigate this, let's look at both the oscilloscope and the spectrum analyzer so we can watch the content that we're actually generating from the synthesizer coming out in real time. I'm going to start by leaving oscillator 1, or operator 1, as it might be referred to in FM synthesis, set to the actual MIDI note that we're triggering. Then I'm going to take oscillator 2, set it to have a 0 relationship to the incoming MIDI note, so it's always going to be the same frequency regardless of the note that I play. And then let's start by setting it to a frequency of 1. So now this modulation network is laid out that we see the modulator across the top, and then on the left-hand side represents oscillators 1, 2, 3, or 4. We can't frequency modulate white noise because it has no center frequency. We could bring in an additional modulator if we wanted to modulate the filter cutoff frequency of the noise source, but for the sake of this modulation network, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to include that as a destination in frequency modulation. So we have our sources across the top, and then destination oscillator 1, destination oscillator 2, destination oscillator 3, destination oscillator 4. So if I want oscillator 2, it's currently set to 1 Hz, to frequency modulate oscillator 1, I'll go to oscillator 2, and then the little box on the first row here, and I'll start to increase that amount. But before I do that, let's first play a note. I'm going to bring up my sustain value so it lasts forever and bring down my attack and release times. And then I'm going to slowly bring up the amount of influence that oscillator 2 has on oscillator 1. So there we see more or less a pure sine tone, and this is one of the things I was kind of talking about at the start of this video, is that these oscillators, bring down the release time. These oscillators produce close to pure sine tones. So if we look at in the oscilloscope, it sure as heck looks like a pure sine tone, smooth oscillation back and forth between positive and negative values. Then when we look at the spectrogram, granted it's not hyper-specific spectrogram here, but we can see that we've got one big low frequency that's really loud. Then sometime later or higher up the spectrum, we get another frequency that's not quite as loud as the as the lowest frequency, but pretty loud, and then so on and so forth, slowly scaling off. So this actually looks very similar to a saw waveform that we might find in the polysynth in terms of spectrum. So it's not a pure sine tone that we would hope to have in FM synthesis, but perhaps the makers of Bitwig have done this because it's more of an analog sound. So if we're working with an analog instrument, they'd have a sine tone that sounds and looks more like this, whereas if we were working in the digital world, it would be just pure single frequency sine tone generators. So if you're looking for a warmer sound, the FM-4 is pre-programmed to give you a warmer sound in FM synthesis, but it's not going to be as pure as some of the other synthesizers that use FM synthesis might be able to do. So getting back into it, side notes aside, if I grab this little box and I start to drag it up and we watch the output, watching that spectrogram, especially focusing on that lower frequency, we'll see it start to dance a little bit. We can see some distortion as I move this around, but watch that peak and its frequency, and now you can just see it starting to move up and down. And now you should probably be able to hear it moving up and down. I'll be quiet for a second. Kind of feels like you're sick. And now, as soon as we pass over 200, we've actually pushed the amount of modulation from modulator 2 on modulator 1 over a boundary of clipping. So it's actually now distorting the sine tone being generated by oscillator 2, which is why it's kind of jumping around a little bit. So if I go back under 200, we're back to smooth up and down modulation. So this is setting how much is oscillator 2 causing the frequency of oscillator 1 to go up and down. But then as we start to increase the frequency of oscillator 2, we'll start to have that up and down motion happening faster and faster and faster, until we hit nearly 20 times per second up and down motion. Then we'll start to lose track of the rhythmic aspects. It's just going to become more of a timbral thing. Some of these sound more pleasing or more consonant than others, and that's just a result of them being more simplistic relationships between the frequency of oscillator 2 and the frequency generated by oscillator 1. The more complex, the more dissonant or noisy they'll sound to our ears. So like that one. So oscillator 1 must be at some frequency that's of a simple relationship to nearly 87.3, where it's not of a basic relationship to 89.3. That's much noisier and more disgusting. So without touching the modulation matrix, I could use the mod dial on oscillator 2 to remove it from the modulation matrix. Back to our smooth sine tone of oscillator 1, then gradually increase the amount of modulation of 2. Cool. So that's FM synthesis, where we're using one oscillator to modulate the frequency of another oscillator. Sometimes, and as FM-4 is set up to do, we can have a very similar, and in fact it's exactly the same form of synthesis called harmonic modulation synthesis, HM synthesis, where rather than having one oscillator that might be moving in relationship to the MIDI note modulated by an oscillator that is not moving in relationship to the MIDI note, we'll have them both move in relationship to that MIDI note. So if I set these both to 1, now we've got harmonic modulation, because as I play new notes, the relationships between the modulating oscillator and the oscillator being modulated remains constant, which means that we remain with a constant timbral results of that. So just to quickly show you what I mean, if I go back to how we just had this at, like, let's go with that 93.9 or whatever and sweep up the modulation amount. Super nasty, but if I play another note, they're all fairly crunchy, but they all have slightly different timbres to them because the relationship between those two frequencies is changing. So if I switch it back now to where there's no frequency offset and they're both giving me exactly the note that we want to play, and I start by sweeping that mod down, and I play a note and I drag it up, you hear that immediately we have not only a more consistent and more pure and more pleasing sounding timbral results of this modulation, but it's also consistent as I play other notes. And that's HM synthesis. It's the same exact thing as FM synthesis, and hardly ever, probably other than this video, will you hear anybody declare the difference between FM and HM. But that's the subtle difference, that this FM-4 is really most of the time not an FM synthesizer, but an HM synthesizer. But it does give us more musical results out of the process rather than disgusting results. So if you're looking for the weird sounds, just turn all these oscillators from responding to that incoming MIDI note to only hertz, and you'll get some really crazy things. If you're looking for more pleasing results, then keep these numbers at basic integers. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and no frequency offset, or if any, just a little bit. So we could also change this to 0.5 and modulate it by the octave below, which sounds great, or the octave up, or octave in a fifth, or 2 octaves, and so on, and so on, and so on. So then what we're overlooking at the moment is we've still got 2 other oscillators, plus this crazy modulation matrix, which includes a noise source. And we can route all of these as many locations as we want to. So in fact, we could actually have oscillator 2 going back and modulating itself. So if I return this back to 1, and I start to bring up destination 2 or source 2, oscillator 2, going to the frequency of itself, it gets nasty really quick. I could also have oscillator 1 going back and modulating oscillator 2, and again getting really nasty. Or I could bring in a new oscillator, have oscillator 3 modulating oscillator 2, change its frequency relationship. Sounds nice. And I could bring in oscillator 4 to modulate oscillator 3, but let's drop it down to 0.25. Oops, 0.25, so 2 octaves below. Let's bring in the noise source, but let's have it go crazy distorted. And then bring up the amount of influence that has on oscillator 2. Sure. And that's kind of hideous. But hopefully that's helping make the modulation matrix make sense. So what's made this all successful or possible is the fact that we're only listening to the output currently of oscillator 1. So all these other oscillators in the noise source are only serving to modulate the function or the frequency of oscillator 1, which is the only one that's being fed out of our FM-4. So for example, I could also bring up the noise source. We could flip this all around, get rid of oscillator 1, bring up the noise source, have just a little bit of oscillator 2 coming out of there, and some of oscillator 4, and then a little bit of oscillator 3, and then sneak in some of oscillator 1, and then pitch all that up, or down, and it all left. so forth. So one of the things that's going to make this really successful for creating some more complex sounds is the fact that we've got modulators for it. So if you come over here, we can click Add Modulator, and probably one of the first modulators that you'll want in FM synthesis is another envelope. So let's add in an attack, decay, sustain, and release envelope, which is an exact copy of what we've got down here for our amplitude envelope generator. And we can click on the little modulation routing button down here, and then we can set that to modulate some things. But before we do that, let's turn down the amount of modulation for all of these down to the bottom. And click on it again and set this envelope to have the possibility of driving those all the way up to the top. And then let's exit out of map mode and click on the little triangle there to show our amplitude envelope generator. Then we can set our nice short attack time, a little bit longer decay time, and let's go no sustain and about the equal release time to our decay time. And let's bring down the levels of all these guys so we're only listening to the output of oscillator 1. Let's make that decay a little bit snappier. Add some reverb to that. And maybe let's bring in another envelope generator. This one only modulates that oscillator 2, so let's have that one set to modulate oscillator 2, but just a little ways up, and then let's crack open this guy, give it a nice long attack time, nice long decay time, and then no sustaining value. So now we get and let's turn off mono, and let's right click on this and make sure that per voice is enabled so that we get one envelope for every single note that I play. So we can have polyphonic modulators, which is mind-blowing. Awesome. Cool. So now we can start to do some interesting things. So that is the FM-4. Hopefully that helps kind of crack open the possibilities of this. Maybe in some future videos we'll take a look at some more sound design possibilities with this, especially with working. Oh, it was hard to say. Especially when working with MPE-enabled devices like the Raleigh Seaboard Rise and things like that, because that's one of the things that's really cool about Bitwig, that we've got some really incredible expressive possibilities. So thanks for watching. I hope you found this video helpful. Please don't forget to like and subscribe or leave any questions or comments you may have below. All right, thanks.